In the introduction to Victorian literature, we have seen how Victorian writers were very much interested in the state of the country, in social issues, in social analysis, and that they wanted to sort of get back to this more involved social engagement that we had seen in the 18th century. And we also saw that the novel emerged as the most apt form, literary form to express that. So indeed, one of the early novelistic developments is this what we might call the industrial novel or the social novel. We also looked at the fact that industrialization was a development that heavily influenced particularly the early 18th century, and changed the fabric of society in a way. And this was what many of these novels were all about. They were also sometimes called condition of England novels. And the term condition of England novels refers to a group of narrative fiction that are also known as industrial novels or social problem novels that were published in England during and after the time of the so-called Hungry 40s, the 1840s, that were marked by a blight in the potato harvest several years, and that brought widespread famine, most importantly in Ireland, but that generally brought about hunger and impoverishment, and that sort of intensified this engagement with the social problems in England. And the term condition of England directly refers to the so-called condition of England question that was raised by Thomas Carlyle in his essay Chartism from 1839. And Chartism, in turn, is a Victorian era working class movement for political reform in Britain that emerged between 1838 and 1848. So this was a working class movement before the invention of socialism. I gave you the dates for the writings, the early writings by Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx. So this is really sort of leading up to that. But we see sort of a lot of engagement with these questions. So Condition of England novels sought to engage directly with the contemporary social and political issues, with a focus on the representation of class, gender, and labor relations, with a focus on social unrest, but also on the growing antagonism between the rich and the poor in England. This widening of the gap between the rich who always became richer and the poor who actually became poorer. So these are maybe some things that actually remind us a little bit of today. And these novels try to really be a repository of social conscience, an ability to empathize with unbearable social iniquities and injustices, so to encapsulate a social conscience. A number of writers were strongly motivated to arouse sympathy for the conditions of the emerging working class. But it's very important to note that the social novels did not emerge out of the working class. It's not working class writers who try to provide an authentic voice of their experience, but it's rather a middle class perspective on the plight of the poor, on the plight of the working class. So arousing sympathy in the readership as well, because the readership still is strongly middle class. But the whole idea is still very much based on paternalism, and that is sort of the dominant ideology in Victorian England. This idea that you have sort of kind of this social obligation to do something for those who can't really help themselves. So really like a father who needs to care for his children because he knows that they can't help for themselves, but that also means that the father knows best what is best for the children, and the father can set the terms and set the limits. So this is very much sort of a top-down kind of reform movement, in that these writers analyzed what was wrong with society and analyzed how to help the poor, but always from the position of the middle class in a way. These industrial novels all share some common characteristics. We have the detailed documentation of the suffering of the poor. It's a way, of course, I mean, narrative in general in a novel is a very good way to make other people experience these conditions and what was wrong in society at the time. Also, the reproduction of working class speech through dialect. So these were realistic in that sense, in that they tried to get an authentic picture, not by using people who actually came from that background, but by at least sort of trying to reproduce that. There's the criticism of the effects of industrialization as sort of a theme that runs through these books. And there is the discussion of these contemporary reform movements like Chartism and utilitarianism. So the discussion of social problems is very aware in the sense that they're actually you have people in these books debating how to reform society and what is a solution and what to do about this and how to organize these kinds of reforms. And then there is usually some attempt, and that is often an individual or an internal attempt at a solution to social problems. There's something that I already observed in when we talked about Jane Austen. This idea that social problems are best tackled by changing the individual, and of course that has sort of some sense in it. If you change every individual, then you also have changed the society. So similarly, what most of these novels argued for was less a complete revolution, a complete overturn of society, but rather this sort of individual change, solutions that were sort of more focused on the individual. Frequently, the plot is developed around a sensitive protagonist, usually male, whose moral, intellectual, or emotional development spans the course of the novel, and whose romantic attachments are troubled and conflicted. So we're really focusing on these problems through the lens of a middle class kind of spokesperson who needs to grow in awareness of the problem, who needs to develop and see these problems, and becomes a spokesperson. So the protagonist is typically searching for a way to express or to mitigate the dissatisfaction of the working class, and he takes the role of the spokesperson. There are numerous works that fall into this category. Too much to mention, obviously, and I'm not going to go into to details here, but just so that you have an idea of names of authors and books. Authors associated with this are Benjamin Disraeli, Elizabeth Gaskell, of course, Charles Dickens, who already started this with Oliver Twist, and Hard Times is one of the central industrial novels in the canon, but also Charlotte Bronte's Shirley and Charles Kingsley with Alton Locke and Yeast. Now, from this more general look at one major subgenre of novel writing, I want to at least very briefly introduce three writers that are seen as central to the development of the Victorian novel particularly. And the first one of these is Charles Dickens. Created some of the most memorable fictional characters and is, together with George Eliot, regarded generally as the greatest novelist of the Victorian period. Already during his own life, his works enjoyed unprecedented fame. His novels and short stories were widely popular at his time, and Dickens was one of the first to really to use readings and public lectures as a way to enhance his popularity. So he would tour extensively and do readings. He went to America, where he was celebrated frenetically by enthusiastic readers. So he also was a very visible public figure in that regard. And his novels and short stories continue to be widely popular even until today. Dickens' novels were, among other things, works of social commentary. We've already encountered him several times in the context of social novels, problem novels, and so on. And indeed, he was a fierce critic of the poverty and of the social stratification of Victorian society. Again, there's these sort of differences between the social classes. Dickens's second novel, Oliver Twist of 1839, actually shocked his readers with its images of poverty and crime. As I said, this was one of the things, this sort of authentic rendering of the terrible conditions that people lived in, and that was something that hadn't been a subject of the novel before. To actually look at this place, and this is the sort of the iconic scene of Oliver Twist, this poor little orphan who is in this workhouse for the poor, where he stands up and asks, "Can I have a little bit more? Can I have a little bit more food?" Because he's hungry. And that sort of is the beginning of his downfall in a way, because he's not supposed to do that. He's not supposed to ask for more. So these scenes actually shocked many of his readers. And in his later career, his novels actually became even more disillusioned and darker in tone in his look at contemporary society. Now, another thing that Dickens is known for and is important in the development of the novel is his use of episodic writing, because most of Dickens's major novels were not written and published as one text, but rather they were written in monthly or sometimes weekly installments that were published in journals, and only later, once the story was finished, were actually reprinted in book form. So here you see one contemporary advertisement for this. So you would read, you would subscribe or buy the journal, and every week you could read a new chapter, a new installment in the developing story of Great Expectations, for example, here. These installments made the stories cheap, accessible, and the series' regular cliffhangers made each new episode widely anticipated. So the episodic writing form isn't just sort of incidental, but because Dickens had to keep his readers interested, he had to make sure that every chapter, every installment ends in such a way that you really want to know how it goes on. So this is basically the invention of the cliffhanger, where you literally sort of the protagonist is hanging on from a cliff and says, "Oh, will he fall?" And then the episode is over, and you need to know what happens. So you need to get the next installment. And in fact, Dickens was the first to do this, but he popularized the method, and serial publication of narrative fiction, in fact, became the dominant Victorian mode for novel publication. And part of Dickens's great talent was to incorporate this episodic writing style, but still end with a coherent novel at the end, so that it wouldn't just sort of develop one episode after another, like for example the picaresque novel had also had was also told in these episodic stories, but very often these would just develop from one episode to another and not add up to something greater. And that's what Dickens's novels, of course, do. When you read them now, you usually forget the fact that they were written from week to week, because you see the big picture. And that's, of course, one of the things that makes it great. The other thing is that this is an early example of almost participatory literature, in that Dickens didn't write the whole story and then publish it sequentially, but he wrote it as he went along. So what he could do is he could actually evaluate his audience's reaction, and he could modify his plot and his character development based on the feedback that he would get from readers who would write to him. Oh, I like this development. Oh, I hope this happens. Oh, I hope that doesn't happen. So he could actually model his development on some of these reactions. And finally, as I already mentioned right at the beginning, Dickens is often regarded as the greatest creator of character in English fiction, at least after Shakespeare. He has, I mean, he's written many novels, and these novels are chock full of characters, and these characters are always very distinct, always very often extravagant, with typically whimsical names. You can see some of them here on the page, and they're amongst the most memorable in English literature. They're actually now part and parcel of British culture. In some cases, they have actually passed into ordinary language. A Scrooge, for example, that's the main character from A Christmas Carol, is a miser, is someone who is who doesn't give his money freely. These characters have really become sort of a national repertoire of thinking about British characters. So you can read, which means you can read Dickens novels really for several reasons. You can read it for learning something about England at the time, for the condition of England. You can read it for the plot development, which always keeps you interested in the story, and you can read it purely for the depiction of the characters. In any case, reading Dickens is always a pleasure and always something worth doing. Next up is William Makepeace Thackeray. Maybe a little bit less well known today, but at the time, Dickens' greatest rival in the first half of Queen Victoria's reign for the position of the most eminent novelist. He had a similar style to Dickens, but he had a slightly more detached and barbed satirical view of his characters. So with Dickens, maybe we feel a little bit more sympathy for the character, and with Thackeray, the irony, the satire is sort of a little bit stronger and a little bit more detached. He also tended to depict a more middle-class society than Dickens did. Dickens' novels are often set in the lower classes, not all the time, but more often than those of Thackeray, who had sort of a middle-class focus in his characters. As a novelist, Thackeray constantly fought for literary realism, and this quest led him to parodying and burlesquing literary forms, genres, and conventions in his sort of engagement with realism. Now, if the 18th century was the age of satire and the 19th century was the age of sincerity or earnestness, as we saw in these very serious and earnest condition of England novels, then Thackeray can be seen as an 18th century satirist that was actually just born 100 years too late. His mindset was very much closer to the neoclassical 18th century idea of satire than to this seriousness of Victorian society. His championing of literary realism led not only to the debunking of literary conventions, but also to the debunking of a too romantic, a too heroic view of human nature. He looked at human nature with a satirical view, and he sort of exposed the faults, and we can actually see sort of the line of tradition that he comes all the way from Johnsonian city comedy through neoclassical satire to this place. What you see here is his most well-known and central novel, Vanity Fair. And Vanity Fair, the title, of course, comes from Pilgrim's Progress, but you can see here, this is the original title page, you can see that it has a subtitle, a novel without a hero. And that, of course, has sort of several connotations. On the one hand, it shows how these Victorian novels were very often not so much focused on central characters, but rather on social structures. So you had multiple characters that interact with each other, and not a single hero that sort of determines all the stories. But it also tells us that there isn't a hero in the story. There isn't one unambiguously good character in the novel, and that actually is a fact. There are virtually no heroes anywhere in Thackeray's fiction. All of the characters are ambiguous, conflicted, and so on. So Thackeray really loved to satirize the pretension of individuals to heroism. So these attempts of becoming heroic, and he liked to deflate that as satire tends to do. And there are really sort of two main types that tend to populate his fiction. There's the rogue who attempts to camouflage his roguishness, and there's the commoner who adopts aristocratic airs. And both kinds of protagonists pretend to be what they are not, either less roguish or more aristocratic than they actually are, and therefore this satiric mode is the best to counter that. The mock heroic is actually Thackeray's most natural mode. Thackeray's realism, his refusal to believe in heroic action, or maybe also in marriage as a happily ever after conclusion to a narrative, was often seen as cynicism. His realism extends to endings in which individuals accept their diminished expectations. In fact, Vanity Fair, which is a huge, sprawling novel of many, many hundreds of pages, concludes with the sentence, "Which of us has his desire, or having it is satisfied?" So, I mean, after all of this struggling, after all of this working on Vanity Fair, on attempting to be something, whoever reaches what they want. Yet the tone of Thackeray's work is not bleak or tragic. It is actually convivial and witty. So he also, similar to Fielding, for example, uses an omniscient narrator that comments, but these are really great conversationalists. They're people that we would be enchanted to meet at a pub or a literary club. So it's very entertaining to listen to them. So these are also books that read very well, and that provide us with a lot of insight into the Victorian period. And with the third writer, George Eliot, the writer who famously took on a male pseudonym, and that's always seen sort of as an indication that of the difficulty that women had to succeed on the literary market. Now, with this writer, we turn back from witty satire to the seriousness that we usually associate with the Victorian novel. In fact, Virginia Woolf later on called Eliot's major novel, Middlemarch, one of the few English novels written for grown-up people. So this is really this is a type of novel that, in its seriousness and its engagement with topics and with characters, tries to grow the novel into a new kind of maturity. What Eliot was after was what we nowadays would call a psychological realism. So to do justice to the characters, to provide deep psychological insights into the characters, and to create really sophisticated character portraits. So people who you feel could actually exist, could really be something, and not just stock types that have a certain function, or caricatures. Like, remember Dickens, I mean, they're very memorable, but you can easily see them as caricatures. That makes them very functional, that makes them very effective, but you don't expect to meet them in real life. This is different maybe with Eliot's characters, who she fleshes out in a way that makes them psychologically realistic. And when we're looking at the narrator, we don't have that kind of sort of flamboyant, witty, Fielding-esque narrator that we see in Thackeray. But what we see is the intelligence of the narrator and his sympathy with the human condition in general. So instead of having sort of this very, very harsh satirical view of the characters who are declared as not being heroes right from the start. Um, Here we find no caricatures. Here we find rather a willingness to see them for what they are, for the humanity that they have. Each character is known so thoroughly that whatever is reprehensible or even at times criminal in this character is understood in terms of a complex of human desires that is not very different from those of the reader himself. So we're rather asked to identify and to put ourselves in those shoes and to see them as similar to us than in this detached, ironic style that pushes us away from them. A similarity that we see is, of course, then a move away from focus on individuals, and again we have here the title itself, Middlemarch, is a place instead of a character. And even the subtitle sort of emphasizes that further when you see that this is a study of provincial life. This isn't about a story, an event, or a character, but really it's about sort of this panorama of provincial life. You can see this a little bit in attempts to map, for example, the character relations, and you can see just sort of the amount of characters that we have here and how intricately they are all connected, and how we have clusters, but everyone is connected with everyone else in a different way. So this is really what Judge Eliot, and particularly Middlemarch, provide us with this absolutely deep and thought out and fleshed out portrait of Victorian society that is less strictly concerned with social structures, or that not only with social structures, but that sort of combines that with these deep character portraits, because it is, after all, also a political novel. It falls into this spectrum of being interested in social development. Political crisis actually is at the heart of Middlemarch, in which he presents the stories of a number of inhabitants of a small English town on the eve of the Reform Bill of 1832. So the point in time when the story is set is really this moment of political change that we often see as ending the Romantic era and beginning a new phase that is characterized by Victorianism. So those were looks at Victorian society, looks at the lower classes, at the working class, looks at middle class pretensions to greatness, to aristocratic height, looks at provincial life. But of course, this particularly the Victorian period is a time when England isn't just concerned with England, but when England is very much a world power, an empire that spreads its influence in certainly very strong and often very problematic ways around the globe. In fact, the Victorian era sees the height of British colonialism and British imperialism. By the end of the 19th century, nearly 1/4 of the Earth's land surface was part of the British Empire. Nearly 1/4 of the Earth's land surface. You could just, I mean, look at the world map. In case you don't know, this is England, and I don't know which point of time that is exactly, but you see all of the places that are marked here are part of the British Empire. So these are huge land masses, and they've already lost America, and further here, and so this is really a time when this tiny island rules over more than 400 million people that were governed from Britain. And of course, all of this goes along with ideas, with an ideology that stands sort of behind this spread. Because of course this spread of the British Empire didn't happen just by itself. It was most of what happened was actually military conquest. During this period, Britain was involved in fierce competition for acquiring new territories. It wasn't the only country, it wasn't the only European country to look for colonies, to look for new territories to incorporate into their colonial empires. It engaged actually in wars, in colonial wars for this, particularly in Africa. The empire went to war with several indigenous people over the course of this period, the Ashanti, the Zulus, the Boers, to name only a few. So you might remember when I introduced the Victorian period, as I said, this was a period of relative peace and stability, the so-called Pax Britannica, 100 years without war. But that, of course, meant without wars in England. England was fighting a lot of wars at the time as this happened. So Britain was becoming increasingly invested, both imaginatively and ideologically, in this idea of empire, and develop sort of an ideology to go along with that. And that is the notion of colonialism, of course. Colonialism involves the settling of territories and the transformation, the Victorians would have called it reformation, of the social structure, culture, government, and economy of the people found there. And you can already see sort of the echoes of the social condition novels that were based on this paternalistic idea of I'm looking at your problems from an elevated position, and I, as your good father, know what's best for you, so I'm going to help you, but we're going to do it on my terms. And this basically extended to a global perspective is what colonialism is, to say, oh, look at these poor people, these poor uncivilized countries where people are living in poverty, and there's disease, and there's maybe tyranny, and we got to do something about that. So it's really in everyone's best interest if we take over, the government, if we take over the handling of things, because that will make you also better. So this was the idea of Britain's civilizing mission. It had sort of this task, because it was so advanced, because it was so strong. It had this task of going out into the world and civilizing the world, making it more civilized. So this was, of course, the major strategy to justify the expansion into other people's lands. I mean, it's not like they were settling uninhabited islands. They were coming to places where people had lived forever. So claiming the civilizing mission based on its own moral, racial, and national superiority. So late Victorian science sought to prove that non-Europeans were less evolved, both biologically and culturally, and thus unable to govern themselves or to develop their own territories. So this goes along, basically this goes along with racism, to say, yes, well, we are better, and that's why we have this position to do something, and of course it's only in your best interest. So again, this is at the core of this is this idea of paternalism. So thus these poor people, these poor countries were patently in need of taming, and taking on this job was, in the famous words of the poem by Rudyard Kipling, the author of the Jungle Books, the white man's burden. So Kipling's poem really is a great exemplification of the mind frame of this civilizing mission and colonialism and imperialism. Kipling wrote this to America. This was after one of the first engagements of America in a way that could make it a colonial power. And Kipling actually says, you should do this. You should take up the white man's burden. Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile. to serve your captives' need. This is the idea, right? You slave them, you make them captives, but you actually do that in order to serve their need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. This is the idea of the uncivilized people that are being caught, half devil and half child. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. This is almost Orwell, who will, of course, write in or have his party of 1984 write "War is Peace." The savage wars of peace fill full the mouth of famine and bid the sickness cease. So fighting disease and fighting poverty. And when your goal is nearest to end for others sought, watch sloth and heathen folly bring all your hope to naught. And this notion of the white man's burden really sort of became a theme, a topic. You find that, for example, here in this commercial for soap, where you see this immaculate colonial officer, and you see, and the writing says the first step towards lightening the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness, which you of course do best with soap. And you can see here, for example, this image of the colonialist giving something to the colonial subject, and so on and so forth. But of course, already back at the time, people understood the hypocrisy in this idea of the white man's burden. So here you see a contemporary caricature that is also called the white man's burden, where you see these fat American and British and German people on the backs of these poor, emaciated colonial subjects. We will come to the criticism of the colonial project later on in the period, but of course I also want to mention that one of the effects of this expansion, of this people going out into the colonies and bringing back stories, not so much people, this isn't yet the big influxes of immigrants from the colonies, but people of course came back with stories, and the people back home were fascinated by these places. So one thing that emerges is literature about these, about travel, about exploration, about colonial wars, and about the adventures that can be had. So this is really one of the sources for this sort of exotic adventure fiction. One of the main, and Africa was especially a place for projections of fantasies of domination. Africa promised mystery because it was, as a place, it hadn't been discovered fully yet. There were still places that were white spots on European maps where no European had actually been. So you could still go there and discover things, and that meant you didn't even know what you would find in the interior of Africa. And of course, it promised enrichments. There are these particularly gold mines, diamond mines, and so on. One of the very, very popular writers of these sort of African adventure fiction was H. Rider Haggard, and you see here two of his most prominent books, King Solomon's Mines and the sequel She, that also sort of adds an element of mystery to this. This has at its center has the adventurer Alan Quatermain, name that you might have heard from the movie version from the 80s, but it's also sort of basically the blueprint for people like Indiana Jones, this kind of adventure into these places that discovers ancient ruins, ancient civilizations, and of course ancient riches as well. And I mean, this was based on true facts. Africa was exploited in this sense, actually, that the riches were being taken out. This is the Kimberley mine. This is a diamond mine and this, what you see here is the largest hole that has ever been created by humans, and it was actually dug by people who were looking for diamonds. So diamonds were sort of one of those sort of symbols for the riches that you could find in Africa. And this is what the adventurers are after in King Solomon's mines. So this is the story of this group of adventurers who travel to this unknown place. They start here at the river and they go through. This is a desert. Here, this is a desert. So they have a plan where there's this one place where you can find water, which means you can go through the desert. And then here's this range of mountains that seems unpenetrable. But there is one way through, which is between these two prominent mountains that are called Sheba's breasts, and then they travel. Then they find King Solomon's road. So they suddenly find a road in the middle of the jungle. So there was this ancient civilization of King Solomon who was there, and he built that road. And the road leads straight to the mines. Where they find diamonds and treasures. And what this shows here, and this map is actually part of the original edition of King Solomon's Mines. I wanted to use this to show the way that Africa is projected as this place of opportunity and place of exploitation and mystery, and how that even is symbolically sexualized in a way. Because if you take this map and you can see what happens if you turn it around, when you basically have an image of a female body, and that is to be colonialized, that is to be discovered, and that is to be exploited, and that of course is also something that happened. And it just shows how writers used this fascination with the colonial project to layer it in several ways as riches, sexual conquest, political conquest, violence. There is also fighting in there, and so on. So this is what I mean by sort of the colonial or the imperial Gothic, and there's sort of a rich tradition, and rich and problematic tradition of enticing the minds of people back home in Britain by these fantasies of Africa. And maybe just as a side note, this tendency of literature to project an image of Africa, an idea that is maybe much more limited than the actual reality of Africa, is not something that we have gone past exactly. If you look, for example, at contemporary book covers of books about Africa, this is pretty much how they look like. So this tells us still that we like to have a preconceived notion of these other places, and this notion is reinforced by literature, and this is of course something that happens in particularly in the Victorian era, that our ideas of places like India, Africa, are actually created, constructed through official political discourse, but also through literature, also through the stories that are being told about these places. These stories, particularly the Asia Rider Haggard stories, are also part of one major sort of subgenre of Victorian adventure fiction, and that is the lost world narratives. This is a time when actual real-life discoveries of ancient civilizations happened. Troy, the remains of Troy were uncovered in 1868. The Egyptian Valley of the Kings, and Great Zimbabwe as well. Investigations starting in 1871. So this was something that happened, that you could still sort of detect these civilizations. So you have this range of adventure fiction that have adventurers finding these places actually intact, often where the civilization is still going on, and that has texts like Rudyard Kipling's The Man Who Would Be King, Arthur Conan Doyle, who's of course more well known as the author of Sherlock Holmes, but also as the name giver for this genre with his book *The Lost World* of 1912, or Edgar Rice Burroughs in *The Land That Time Forgot*. So this is a type of story that would continue to be developed into the 20th century. But whereas stories like these adventure stories are, of course, of British subjects going out into the world and bringing England in a way with them into the world, there are also stories of what we might call the return of the colonial other, of the colonial subject coming back literally to haunt British society. As I said, this isn't yet a phase of mass immigration, but that doesn't mean that these kind of xenophobic, racist fears aren't something that is already articulated. And it's articulated, of course, again in a symbolic way through fiction. And Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1897 is just can be read as just another expression of this kind of fear, because after all, what is Dracula after all if not this strange, frightful other that comes from this place in the East where the diseases come from, and that comes to England, literally brings his own soil with him, brings his own laws with him, and brings this contagious disease of vampirism to England. And Dracula is literally crossing boundaries, crossing thresholds in three different layers. He's crossing national boundaries in that he's coming from Transylvania, this place behind the forest, so this faraway place. So he literally comes from this place and breaches the national boundary of England. He breaches the boundary of the domestic boundary of the home. We're going to talk a little bit more about the home, but this idea of the private sphere of the family home as a sacred space is something that is established very firmly in Victorianism, and this is something that Dracula breaks into. He steps into the house, and then finally he breaks the last frontier, the bodily boundary between human beings, in that he bites and sucks the blood and has this sort of exchange of blood, and this contamination. So in many ways, this is really sort of a colonial anxiety fantasy of the return of the colonial other.